Imagine being lost on an island in the Arctic for over 5 years, with just a wooden hut for shelter, ice all around, and no rescue in sight. To make matters worse, you're surrounded by polar bears and running desperately low on ammunition. This actually happened to 4 Russian sailors in the mid-1700s. This is their story of survival in the Arctic. In 1743, a merchant from the town of Meissen, Russia, sent a ship with 14 men to hunt whales and seals near Svalbard, a group of icy islands in the far north. At first, things went well. The men had favorable winds for 8 days and some great successes on their hunts. But on the 9th day, everything changed. The wind shifted, and instead of heading where they planned, they were pushed east, farther into dangerous, icy waters. Eventually, they came within about 2 miles of an island the Russians called Little Brown. Suddenly, the ship became surrounded by ice, a major problem for any vessel traveling in the Arctic. Ice closes in, and pressure builds until the vessel can't move at all. As temperatures drop, the surrounding water freezes solid, locking the ship in place for months, sometimes years. At that point, the crew either waits for the ice to separate or they leave, because once the frozen ocean has something solid, it doesn't let go easily. The men held a meeting because they realized things were going bad fast. The mate, Alexis Himkov, spoke up. He remembered that some people from his hometown had once built a hut on this island. If the hut was still there, they might survive the winter. But if they stayed on the ship, they would die. So they made a tough decision. 4 men would leave the ship to explore the island. Those 4 men were Alexis Himkov, his godson Iwan Himkov, Stephen Sharapov, and Fyodor Wergen. The coastline was filled with loose ice floes, big slabs of ice that shift and crash together, moved by wind and waves. These men knew that carrying too much would risk them falling in between the ice pieces and drowning. So they brought only essential items: a musket with enough powder for 12 shots, an axe, a small kettle, about 20 pounds of flour, a knife, a tinderbox and tinder, tobacco and wooden pipes. They made the dangerous crossing and, amazingly, they found the hut they remembered hearing about. It was about 1.5 miles from the shore. The hut was fairly big, 30 feet long, 18 feet high, and 18 feet wide. In the main room, they discovered an earthen stove. This would prove to be incredibly useful. They could bake, heat the hut, or even sleep on top of it for warmth. The exterior of the hut was in bad shape from exposure to the harsh elements, but the men were relieved to have shelter of any kind from the Arctic wind and rapidly falling darkness. Early the next morning, 2 of the men ran back to the shore to retrieve the other men and help them carry as many supplies as they could. They needed food, ammunition, and anything else that could help them survive. But when they reached the landing spot, they saw something shocking. No ice. The sea that had trapped them was now open. A storm during the night must have shifted the ice massively. Even more shocking, their ship was gone. The men feared their ship had been crushed and sunk, or simply carried away by the flowing ice. Whatever the case, they saw no sign of it, and all who were left on board died. Without their ship, the 4 sailors knew they were stuck, stranded on the island with no obvious way out. Then began a long, brutal struggle to survive. First, they repaired their hut. The old wooden boards had cracks in them, which let in gusts of freezing cold air. Luckily, there was moss growing all over the island, which they used to seal the gaps. Next, they needed fire. Fortunately for the 4 men, piles of wood were found floating to shore, driftwood from wrecked ships or trees from distant lands, and they used that for fuel. They made some surprising discoveries among the wreckage on the shore. Iron objects, nails, hooks, and pieces of wood, remains of wrecked ships and other debris that had washed up on the frozen beach. Using that scrap iron, they got creative. They took an old iron hook, heated it using the earthen stove, and shaped it into a hammer. A large stone served as an anvil. With these tools, they forged iron spearheads, which they tied to wooden shafts using reindeer skin, making long, sharp hunting lances. With limited ammunition, the four men needed something to defend themselves against their greatest threat, the apex predator who roamed the Arctic wasteland. Polar bears don't avoid humans, they hunt them. In the Arctic, food is scarce, so anything unfamiliar becomes a target. A trapped ship gives off scent, noise, and movement, and a polar bear can detect that from miles away, tracking it across the ice with a sense of smell strong enough to pick up prey buried beneath snow. They move quietly and watch before they act. When they attack, it's fast and overwhelming. These animals are powerful enough to break through barriers and persistent enough to return again and again. Using their homemade lances, the crew works as a team to defend themselves from polar bear attacks. They become so skilled with their lances that they take to actually hunting the dangerous animals. An insanely risky undertaking, but one that supplied them with much-needed meat. Incredibly, in the 5 years they spend on the island, the men managed to kill no less than 10 polar bears. After their success building lances, they went on to make bows and arrows. They carefully shaped some pliable wood they found and tied sinew from animal tendons to create the bowstring. Using the same technique they used to make their lances, they forged arrowheads from scrap iron and used feathers from seabirds as fletching for their arrows. With their homemade bows and arrows, they traveled across the island, hunting any game they could find. Over the years, they killed around 250 reindeer and a large number of foxes. The meat gave them food, and the skins gave them insulation against the freezing wind. They soaked the animal skins in fresh water, scraped off the hair, then rubbed reindeer fat into the skins to soften them. To sew, they made a needle out of wire and used the sinews from animals for thread. They fashioned thick pants, jackets, and blankets, essential for survival in the Arctic cold. But the cold wasn't the only problem. In the Arctic winter, the darkness is intense and long. To survive mentally and physically, they needed light. They didn't have enough wood to keep a constant fire burning, so they had to come up with something else. On their walk around the island, they found clay-like soil, called loam. They shaped this into a lamp of sorts, heated it until it was red hot, and then quenched it in a starch, which they made by boiling flour. They used reindeer fat as fuel, and made wicks for these lamps using rope found on the shore, old ship hemp, even parts of their own shirts and underwear when supplies ran low. With their homemade lamps, they kept a light burning constantly, from when they built the lamp until the very day they left the island. Their creativity literally kept them alive, but the men still struggled with the weight of their reality. Time loses structure when nothing changes. The same hut, the same ice, the same faces. There's no escape from each other, and no distraction from their thoughts. Home becomes something distant, almost unreal, and the longer they stay, the harder it is to imagine ever leaving. Alexis Himkov especially suffered. He had a wife and 3 kids back in Russia. The fear that he'd never see them again weighed on him every day. After almost 6 long years on the frozen island, things took a turn for the worse. Fyodor Vergin fell terribly ill and died. The remaining 3 men buried their friend in snow, as deep as they could, and covered the grave so that polar bears wouldn't dig up his body. It was a dark time for the 3 sailors, wondering who would be the next to die, and beginning to doubt they would ever see home again. Then, on August 15th, 1749, something miraculous happened. They saw a Russian ship on the horizon. It belonged to a trader who planned to winter in another part of the Arctic, but because of some strong winds and some navigational errors, his ship ended up exactly where the stranded sailors were. The 3 remaining men lit fires on the hills near their hut and made a flag out of reindeer hide on a pole. When the ship's crew saw the signal, they stopped close to shore. The sailors on the island ran to meet them, full of hope and relief. They made a deal. The sailors would work for the ship's captain in return for a ride home. They agreed to pay 80 rubles when they got back. Plus they offered everything they had survived on. 2,000 pounds of reindeer fat, hides of reindeer, blue fox, white fox, skins of all 10 polar bears they'd killed. Their weapons and tools, bow, arrows, spears, knife, axe, awls, and a bone box which held their needles. On September 28th, 1749, they finally made it home. 3 of the 4 men came back strong and healthy, but they'd changed. After living 6 years without bread, when they tried to eat it again, it made them feel bloated. And they couldn't drink alcohol anymore. They just couldn't stomach it. 4 Russian sailors, stranded in the far Arctic, faced brutal cold, dangerous wildlife, and crushing isolation. Yet through skill, creativity, and sheer will, they survived and were rescued. It's a story of grit, desperation, and hope. If you ever think your life is hard, remember, these men lived for years in what many would call a frozen hell on Earth, and still survived.